The key turned with the same reluctant resistance it always had, a small fight between old metal and older weather. It clicked into place like a sentence ending, slow and deliberate, and for a moment the tower smelled of oil and cold wood and the faint sweetness of the field beyond, dry grasses rubbing against themselves in the wind. I set the key down on the ledger where my father's hand had traced the dates for 15 years before me. The page was soft with the motion of fingers, the ink slightly browned at the edges where he had dampened it with the same thumb he used to wind his watch. He had written less and less as the seasons went on, until whole weeks were a single line. Lights on, radio check, mirror sweep. The last full entry had the sentence I had read 1,000 times and still felt like a burn and a balm at once. 15 years. I have been keeping watch, and I have been keeping count. I had come back because of that voice at dawn, because of the hat found in the grass beneath the tower when the sky was still a bottle of pale blue. I had come back because what comes out at night isn't human. The tower is a small cathedral of work. It is a square lattice of iron bolted into the soil, bolted into habit. The floor was scarred where a hammer had found and refound its place, where a coil of rope had rested for years. The generator was a cold animal in the corner, its belly full of diesel, and the smell of it a kind of trust. Start her, she runs. Overload her, she grinds. There were 2 floodlights on swivels at the top, a ring of mirrors bolted to a wooden panel like a kind of unwilling crown, and a radio console older than any of the modern trucks that came up the dirt road. The desk was an altar of small devices, an enamel mug with a chipped rim, a pencil stub given a second life, the ledger where rules were inscribed and repeated until they felt less like instructions and more like confessions. We worked by ritual. The rules were short, and the rhythm of them kept me from unthinking. In the first hour after sunset, I ran a checklist that had become a liturgy. Generator oil check, 75%. Fuel gauge, 60%. Battery bank, 98%. Floodlights, functional. Mirrors, 3 sweeps clockwise. Camera feed, record. Radio, channel cleared for emergency only. I spoke the lists aloud at first, the way a man talks to himself to make sure he's still there, then reduced them to finger counts over the ledger, then to a heartbeat measure against the inner ear, then to silence. Silence is a tool. So is light. Light bruises whatever sits outside the tree line. It makes angles where the forest has only suggestion. When the floodlights are on, the wayward deer and the night birds are momentarily confused, showing themselves between shoots and trunks like broken paper shapes. Light is coarse and practical. You can count the rivets in the generator housing, see the weave of a boot sole, read the slant of a handwriting.
The entity, if it is an entity at all, hates being made ordinary. At least that was the rule my father left, and the rule I learned to worship. Keep the lights, keep the silence. Do not open the door at night. Document everything. Rules in the end were paper and perseverance, but rules helped you notice the pattern. The first anomaly came like a cough through the grass. It was not the kind of sound you could file away. At 03:12 on a spring morning, I heard a voice below the tower call my name. It was not an imitation of my father's voice, with the deep, slow cadence I remembered. It was sharper, mimicking the way he had once said my name when I was small and had fallen off a fence. I stood frozen, the radio in my hand dead and useless by discipline. The floodlights washed the earth like a public bath. The voice said my name again, and then said, "Come down, Brent," in a pitch so familiar I almost believed it. I did not go down. When dawn came, I found a hat in the grass. It was my father's Stetson, a familiar artifact in the way bones are familiar, worn at the crease, ribbon frayed, a small tear near the band where he preferred a cigarette for a time in his younger years. It lay there as if placed with intention, dry against the dew. The hat should not have been there. The last record of him with that hat was in a photograph from his retirement party, the hat on a peg in the kitchen. He had been gone 6 years. The hat was not a proof of agency. It was evidence, thin and terrible and precise. The hat had hair baked into the sweatband, thin, gray, my father's, and a small thread of the scarf my mother used to knot at his collar in winter. Item 0017 in the log, I wrote in block letters. Stetson hat, sweatband with hair matching subject R. McDonald, found 0453, GPS 46.2N 109.6W, linked to subject R. McDonald, deceased. The handwriting on the ledger did not shake. I catalogued the hat like a man cataloging grief. We had, of course, seen strange things before. There were stories in the county files of men who left their posts in the night and never returned, a fisherman who heard a child laugh across water where no child had been. But those were folk tales, until the hat tied the voice to an object and gave the tale an index number. I called Michael at dispatch at 0612. He had the soft voice of someone who had been told the truth too often to be startled by it. He was pragmatic, because pragmatism is a function of his job. Document everything, he said, which is not what I wanted him to say, but what I needed him to say. He sent a team, Maria for rigging and lights, Betty to catalog and process, and Fred to explain what memory looked like when it was institutional rather than personal. Betty arrived with a box full of manila folders and a laptop the color of a sky before a storm. She had the way of people who work with records, a silence that is almost reverence, and eyes that see the bones in a thing.
She opened the box and set the folders like an offering. "If we're going to make this a file," she said, "we'll make it the kind that won't go into a drawer and die." "You can host them," I said. "Anything we find. The tapes, the photos, the ledger." She looked at me as if weighing whether I meant the ask as charity or necessity. "I'll host them," she finally said. "Betty Macon, County Archives. If anyone wants to see the memos, the scans, the spectrograms, they'll be there." It was a small, diegetic concession. She promised to put the case into a public space, which is to say she promised that the quiet things would be seen. It felt like a mercy and a risk at once. Maria and Fred were less theatrical in arrivals. Maria came in with a toolbox and an eye for leverage, floodlight mounts, spare batteries, generator wiring. She moved as if the world could be adjusted like a machine, and in many ways she was right. Fred came with his cane and with names he had kept in his head for decades. He sat down near the radio, rubbed his hands, and said, "The first thing you learn is that truth makes a habit of coming back to you." I did not know whether he meant the past or the thing outside the trees. We set up with a kind of militant domesticity. Mirrors were bolted to the inner face of the upper walkway, 3 at different angles, so that any approach found a reflected angle. Cameras were bolted with cable ties and gaffer tape, 1 on the east face of the tower, 1 pointing along the rutted track to the farmhouse, another hidden under the eaves of the shed across the field. The floodlights were wired to a bank that could be pulsed from the console or set to a steady burn. The generator was prepped with a warm-up schedule, run at 75% for an hour at twilight, reduced to 50% for night cooling cycles, reserve emergency surge at 20% for sudden draws. The batteries were tested, their outputs logged. We set a radio protocol, channel 7 for emergencies only, voice traffic logged and limited to pre-approved codes. In other words, we did the things a watchman does. We turned anxiety into maintenance. I made a new list and read it out to the team, because lists are more binding when you hear them read. "Lights on at 1830, I said. "Mirror sweep at 1900, 2200, 0200. Radio silence except for Alpha and Bravo check-ins. Camera check every hour. Document anything that isn't ordinary. Do not open the door at night. If someone calls from below, do not answer. Not once. Not even if they use a familiar voice." The last line felt like an incantation. The group nodded. We all knew the stakes, and we all knew they had names. Empathy, habit, longing. It was important to say the rules aloud, because the mimic learned patterns. Patterns are instruction manuals for an adaptive thing. It learned the cadence of human plea when left exposed.
My father had suspected as much. He had written in his journal that patience had been a teacher, and that echoes could become voices. That entry was older, ink fading at the edges, and in his hand he had written a line in short, blunt script. "The night listens. Do not teach it our names." After the hat, we had to treat everything as potential instruction. A cup left on the stoop might become a phoneme to be used against you. A lullaby hummed late might be learned and layered into a tape. The smallest personal freedoms, a laugh, a softer word, a sigh, were currency. The ledger became not just a record, but a firewall. Everything was documented with a slow care that made the world seem steadier because it had been named and set down. We ran tests. The first nights were controlled in the way fieldwork becomes controlled, a series of constraints and fail-safes. We would turn the lights on and off at random intervals. We would play recorded fragments through a tethered speaker at the base of the tower to see how echoes behaved. We would pound a rubber mallet against the outer siding and listen for delayed answers. The mimic, if mimicry could be called a partner in an experiment, responded first by imitating environmental sounds it must have heard before: distant truck engines, a dog barking in a cadence, a child's whistle. Those were toys in the hands of a child that had learned the shape of voices.
The first test that made us call in a recorder and stamp the date was audio mimicry. At 01:48 on a humid June night, the console registered a fragment of a voice playing back in the static, a voice that said, "Where are you?" in the soft, late summer way my father used to ask when he wanted to know if I had eaten. It was not a long sentence. It was not a clear one. It was enough. We took the file, ran it through spectral analysis, and observed the waveform. The voice had the harmonic structure of a human, but the background noise had an odd blankness to it, a low band of energy that suggested someone had synthesized the gaps by repeating syllables and smoothing out breath. Evidence 0023. Audio fragment. Waveform shows low band smoothing. Audible human-like vowels. Timestamp 0148. We cataloged trophies. They arrived in the margins of our nights like offerings placed by someone who wanted to be noticed but not spoken to. The first trophy beyond the hat was small and carved, a wooden horse, its edges sanded smooth by hands. It lay on the underside of the shed, tucked into the rafters so that when the sun rose it would catch the light in a small private way. Item 0025, carved wooden horse, painted remnants of red near mane, no maker's mark, found 0502. A name named Clara O'Neill recognized it from a photograph in a school yearbook. It matched a child's wooden toy lost on a family farm 20 miles away in 1989. Another name folded into the ledger like a notch on a banister. The trophies were never random. They were precise and private.
They were the thing that made what we were dealing with moral, not just mechanical. Behind each object was a person who had once loved it, or lost it, or carried it until it was indistinguishable from them. The mimic didn't just need voices, it needed signatures. The more we documented, the more the pattern spread into the files like a mold. Betty's interest was more than archival rigor. It was a hunger to make a map. She set up an index, object number, description, last known owner, linked incident file. She cross-referenced with old missing persons reports and petty thefts and abandoned property notices. Fred would sit with the index and murmur names until the act of naming gave them weight. Ellis, he said once, was always the kind to step off the back porch when somebody called his name. Kids are like that. They think they'll prove bravery. We were not interested in bravery. We were interested in survival. I felt the moral weight of that distinction in my chest. Empathy can make you soft. When someone below the tower calls your name in a voice that resembles a loved one, you have to place the memory of that loved one outside of your decision-making. That was the rule we rehearsed until it began to shape the way we thought. There were nights when nothing happened, and the quiet was a gift. Those nights we repaired things by the light of the console and the orange of the generator's glow. We mended ropes, replaced camera batteries, and argued about minor choices like whether to bolt the mirrors at a steeper angle. My father had kept a hand-repaired spool of copper wire in a tin that had written on it in his hand, "Wire fixes most things." The tin sat on the desk with its lid slightly ajar, and sometimes I would wind the wire through my fingers and feel some continuity with him, some chain of learned patience. And then I would close the tin and remind myself the chain could be used as a noose if you didn't treat it with care. One night in late October, a fog rolled through like the slow wash of a tide. The floodlights made the mist look like broken milk, and the mirrors threw red and white spears across the field. At 23:17, we heard a babble of sound on the channel, not an actual voice, just a phrasal smear. Maria, who had been sitting with the generator's maintenance log, froze. "Did you open the channel?" she asked, though we had all sworn not to. "No," I said. My throat tasted of diesel and adrenaline. The radio showed no incoming signal. The carrier wave was clean. Whatever we heard was in the band but not on it, a modulation that belonged to someone listening and then shaping silence into syllables. We replayed the recording and slowed it down. In the slower sound there was a tremble like a human laugh, and then a whispered, "You keep going, you keep him." The phrase was fractured. It might have been anything. Language is aldehyde for cognition. It fixes things in place.
We isolated the waveform and labeled it. Evidence 0031, low mod noise, contains structured vowel-like forms, perceived phrase, "You keep going." We never played that file to anyone outside the group. Betty put a copy on a flash drive, as she insisted on doing with everything, but she kept her own counsel about making it public. "We have to be certain," she said. "The archive must be defensible. If you want people to pay attention to this, you need to make it impossible for them to say it was a hoax." We all knew what a hoax looked like: a phone call snuck in by a bored prankster, a recording looped for effect. We tempered any drama with a taxonomic discipline. Each item got its number, description, and context. The ledger grew heavy with small things. 0034, child sneaker. Paired? No. Size 5 youth. Found 0412. Linked to missing person AT, 1997. 0038, wristwatch. Engraving. 2M, Love R. 0322, 1991. Linking names to objects made a chain that could be used to speak to an agency. Michael's response was a negotiation between caution and public duty. The agency did not like to be alarmed needlessly. It did not like to spend money where speculation could do. We ran through the calculus in a room that smelled of coffee and old paper. The cost of additional floodlights, the generator upgrades, overtime for rotations. Would the county fund an expanded watch? It would not, unless proof could be made that the phenomenon posed a public hazard beyond rural lore. This is how institutions work. Risk must be quantified before policy will move. Betty, practical and stubborn, argued that what we needed was precisely that, a dossier. If the archive had a public face, then funding could be defended in a public courtroom or a committee hearing. If there were records that could not be ignored, a pattern would force the hand. We'll do this properly, she told Michael in the meeting room, fingers steepled over the table. We will index, we will cross-reference, we will provide metadata, and if this is a pattern, we will make it visible. Michael made notes and nodded like a man who had attended a dozen such meetings in which nothing ever came of the notes. There was a fatigue in his presentation, but also a faint willingness. The hat was hard to file under coincidence. We trained one another in this quiet way, how to count the hours between the generator surges, how to note the exact position of a mirror after a sweep, how to catalog an object without turning it into a story. People want an explanation, Fred said, but sometimes the best we can do is keep the ledger honest. He said ledger as if it were a person. He was right. Honesty in an archive is a kind of armor. It was Maria who first suggested a humane redundancy. If the thing outside learns by repetition, she said, twisting a screwdriver into a socket, then redundancy, deliberate duplication, becomes armor. We replicate voices that are not human and pipe them through speakers at the base.
We rotate the lights in patterns that make it difficult to predict. We run decoy radio noise so that any replay will have to separate signal from designed noise. The idea was architectural, like stacking locks. It was also dangerous. Every noise you add is a lesson the mimic could learn. But it also made the thing's task more costly. There is a principle in defense: increase the enemy's cost. We ran a controlled decoy on a moonless night. A battery of small speakers hidden in the grass played recorded ambient sounds. A tractor coughing, a dog bark, a caller's voice. We kept our mouths shut and watched on camera. The effect was strange and licit. A rustle in the underbrush, a figure sighing, a movement like a hand across a fence. The cameras caught nothing but the speakers. After an hour, the speakers stopped, and the grass was as it had been, obedient. Nothing happened. We celebrated with lukewarm coffee. The mimic did not always take the bait. It watched and waited, and in the watching there was a cruelty I had not wanted to know. It did not always prefer to mimic bright sounds. Sometimes it left trophies, as if to say, I can stand among you, but I choose only to mark. Trophies communicated two things: a memorial and a lesson. They were a proof that the entity could reach into human lives and hand back a signature. They were, in a perverse sense, a courtesy. Each object required an explanation from us. Each object forced us to be specific about a missing human being. The father's journal was a streak of honesty in the files, not a scientific paper, but a living account. I read it in the lamplight over many nights, until the words felt like floorboards that could give under my foot. Parts were banal and domestic: notes about generator oil, a reminder to call the co-op about the transformer, an entry on a day when a stray calf had found its way beneath the fence. And within it were lines that must be quoted, because they were the kind of truth that shaped policy and prayer in the same breath. One late entry was written in a rush, in letters that leaned into one another as if seeking purchase. In it he had written, 15 years, I have been keeping watch, and I have been keeping count. I found the line at 0207, on a night with a wind that shook loose a hinge somewhere. The phrase was not a boast. It was a record and a threat, because the keeping of count promised a continuity that was not neutral. It said someone had been watching this thing for a long time, and that whatever it was, it had been learning for years. We started to adopt his rituals because they had been, so far, useful. We attempted mimicry as training. We recorded voices not to lure, but to inoculate. If the mimic learned the shape of a voice, perhaps learning would be expensive if voices were numerous and contradictory.
So we played a chorus of voices through the tower at midnight. 12 different men, women, and children, each reading a line from a list of phrases that meant nothing when paired with a context. Silence after the chorus was thick.
At 0:43, an answer came back over the grass, a single word folded into the shoulder of the night, but it was not a phrase I recognized. We recorded it anyway and cataloged it as 0:46, returned vocal token, non-identifiable, pitch variable. The ledger filled. Betty typed up the records with a kind of tenderness. She scanned photographs, the hat, the horse, the watch, and placed spectral images beside them. Spectrograms were grainy with data, and when we showed them to Michael, he would tilt his head and ask the practical questions. Who else knows this? Who will pay for us to keep doing it? The answer was always the ledger. The ledger would be the proof. In the middle of one night, I found a flourish in my father's handwriting that made my stomach drop. Folded at the back of his journal was a smaller page, torn from a receipt book, the ink awash by time. There were 3 rules written like commandments. They were short and sharp. I read them aloud to the empty room because that is what you do when you inherit a religion. Light, document, silence. I kept them like prayer beads. The mimic learned by exposure. We learned by cataloging what it returned. Each trophy was a negotiation. Each time it called you by a name it had learned, you had to weigh the cost of empathy against the need to stay alive. In the ledger we wrote with a hand that sought neutrality. Item, time, description, linked missing person, notes. Over time it became a litany of absences. One morning after a week of this slow work, a neighbor phoned about a figure on the road. He had seen someone walking away from the tower at dusk with a pack slung over his shoulder. When we reviewed the camera feeds, the image was grainy and brief. It showed a silhouette moving toward the hedgerow, then a shimmer, then nothing. The tracker in the grass showed a disturbed path and the impression of boot treads leading into the tree line. A child's shoe lay half buried in the leaves. We logged it. Item 053, child's shoe, size 8 youth, partial dirt on leather, found 0620, linked, AT, missing 1997. Not a perfect match, but within the realm of pattern. We called Michael, and he wrote in his notebook with a line of pragmatic dread, escalate monitoring, increase rotations. At night, sometimes the tower felt like an island of competence surrounded by a sea of things that could not be catalogued. The mirrors caught a light and threw it back, and for a moment the world felt like a book with its pages open. I would sit and wind my father's watch and feel the click of the mechanism, small and precise and utterly indifferent to the rest of the world. Watches keep time the way some people keep promises, mechanically and without apology.
My father's watch had been a compass for his patience. We were piecing a map of small horrors, objects returned, voices staged, patterns forming in the margins. There was a pattern of escalation. At first, the mimic provided small tokens. Then it began to play with the edges of our rules. It would imitate environmental sounds in a way that suggested it was testing our response times. It would use radio fragments, not as full phrases, but as half echoes, to see whether we would answer. It paid attention to our checklists, and then produced artifacts that refuted our sense of safety. One night in early March, while snow hung in the pines like wet cotton, a voice came so precisely formed that for a second I almost let the human reflex of kindness guide me. It was not a long sentence. It was a private pet name that my mother had used on the rare mornings when she was feeling tender. I remember the sound of it like a perfume. My hand went toward the hatch handle on the ladder. My fingers closed around cold metal. I remembered the rules and did not move. When the snow melted in April, we found handprints on the base of the tower, the arc of a palm left pressed into damp paint and then frozen. They were not my father's hands. They were not any of ours. Item 0061, handprint, partial, dermaglyphic pattern not matching on file, no match, found 0529. We photographed it, cataloged it, and watched the frames for movement. The handprints were a message. Someone or something had tested the barrier to see whether it would bleed. The line at which the ledger stopped being an accounting and started being a living thing was the day I began dreaming in lists. I woke reciting mirror sweeps like prayers. I woke naming the generator's parts like a family roll call. My father's voice was a sediment at the back of every thought, telling me to count in the dark. He had trained me in habits. Those habits might have been his salvation. They might have been the only thing standing between us and an erosion of sense. We continued to test and to log, and each test sharpened the mimic's learning curve. It had patience greater than ours and a capacity to listen that made the nights feel like rehearsals for encounters we had not yet prepared to endure. That patience made it methodical. It did not run through a repertoire entire. It learned slowly and returned with iterations. We began to think of it not as a series of clever tricks, but as an intelligence that collected signatures the way some men collect stamps, with a patient, methodical hand. The first time I felt something like anger, a domestic and human anger, was when we found a watch with an engraving that matched my mother's handwriting. It had been in a small box of items Betty had sorted from a courthouse estate years ago. The watch was not hers.
The engraving had 2 initials, M.R. We logged it. We placed it in an evidence bag and sealed it.
Fred sat beside the evidence and said, "They take our hands and then hand us back what is left of us." He was closer to a prophet than he meant to be. After that night, Maria suggested an experiment in which we reversed the mimic's mechanics. We would leave deliberate false signatures around the property to see what it chose. We planted a glove knitted in a pattern none of the neighboring farms used. We left a child's drawing tucked into a fence post. We left a cassette tape with a nonsense story on it wrapped in aluminum foil. The idea was to pollute the waters with meaningless data so that the mimic's sampling would be less confident. The first thing it returned was an old kitchen spoon, stainless, polished, and engraved with initials that belonged to no one we knew. It lay in the center of the field like a bland offering. We cataloged it as 0078, and Betty cross-checked its markings against the estate ledger. No match. The spoon was an insult and a riddle. It did not contain a signature we could place. It seemed chosen on principle rather than upon affection. There were nights when I would take my father's journal in my hands and read to myself from his entries, as if I could exorcise the fear through repetition. He was not a sentimental man. He wrote with precise attention to detail, but there were lines where he allowed sorrow to enter, always practiced and short. Do not let the thing make of you a map. It was a warning about teaching it what it needed to know. We had begun to make cameras into watchful peers, to use mirrors not as tricks but as witnesses. Mirrors were more useful than cameras in some ways because they gave you the reflex to look for yourself. You would sweep and see an angle of the field you had not counted on, and then, in that flash of reflected light, a shape could be revealed, and so could an intention. Mirrors are not intelligent, but they are honest. They report what they see. The hat remained, catalogued and sealed, until Betty made the call to make part of the archive public. She argued that we were not ready to make everything public, but that a dossier could be useful to force the county to answer for the funds we needed. Michael, who had resisted public statements for weeks, acquiesced when the ledger had accumulated enough linked incidents to make a statistical argument. The rate of unusual disappearances in the area correlated with trophy findings beyond chance. The rigor in Betty's forms shifted the conversation. "We will post a dossier," she said, with redacted names where appropriate, with forensic photos and timestamps. We give the public the facts and let them decide if this pattern is worth funding. It felt, in the unlit hours, like handing the world a cup and saying, "Drink." We published an initial memo that was careful and clipped, with photographs of the hat and the horse and the spectrograms of the audio fragments. The memo made no metaphysical claims.
It listed facts, items, timestamps, witness statements. It was an invitation to attention. When Betty put those files up on her archive, she sent me the link and said, "If anyone wants to see the memos, they'll be there." It was a small diegetic CTA wrapped in a folder of evidence, a world making itself public through rigorous naming. The response was a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and the inevitable pressure from people who wanted answers now, because narrative wants completeness. They wanted a monster to be named, and an ending. We could not provide that, only more ledger, and more light, and more patience. The agency, under the glare of public dossiers, agreed to a modest expansion of funding, additional floodlights for 2 towers, overtime for a rotation schedule, and an upgrade to a generator bank. It was, in bureaucratic terms, a victory. Victory in one register and a prelude in another. With the funding came attention, and with attention came more complex risks. We began to notice that when more people were present at the tower, a rotation of observers, students from a university program, curious journalists, the mimic's behavior changed. It became bolder with small human contingencies. Where before it had left single tokens, now it began to arrange items in a way that seemed to insist on narrative. A shoe placed beside a watch, as if to imagine the hand that might lace it on. A child's toy balanced on a stone facing the tower. The trophy suggested an attempt not merely to mark, but to construct a story. At 02:01 on a May night, after a shift change that had brought 2 volunteers and a grad student up the rutted road, we recorded a phrase that was unambiguous in its ownership. Not an imitation, not a test, but a possessive clause folded into the night. The audio captured a voice, layered perhaps with at least 2 timbres, that said, "You stay,
you keep it. The phrase was not carved from mercy. It had the flatness of someone reading a label. It implied a jurisdiction. This was a place that belonged to an outside thing, if the watchman did not keep it. The voice was not human in intention. It used human words to declare a human-style ownership. When we played that clip in the morning, the silence in the room lengthened. We wrote the timestamp, 0201, file 0119, layered voices, perceived phrase, you stay, you keep it. We cataloged the volunteers who had been on rotation and cross-referenced the times they had last checked their signs. The mimic had crossed a threshold from tests and trophies to a rhetoric of possession. It was not announcing itself as a conqueror. It was speaking in a possessive grammar that implied it understood what stewardship meant. That is what made it dangerous. It grasped the concept of duty. I sat with that phrase in my head like a stone. It had the effect of making my father's rules feel both like a blueprint and a dare.
If someone, something, could declare possession over a place and demand that humans keep it, then the act of stewardship became a resistance not only against disappearance, but against an ideology. The lantern in the tower guttered as if in sympathy. We tightened the protocol. We made rotations more frequent. We required two-person checks on the ladder for nighttime descents, which in practice meant that no one could climb down alone. We added a code word system for emergencies. If someone below called with a voice that matched a loved one, they were to use a prearranged phrase that only living people on the roster would know. We tried to make intimacy into a password. It felt like armor. But armor is never perfect. The hat in the grass had proven that. The wooden horse in the rafters had proven that. The ledger grew as if in response to a summons. Each item was an index of a person. Each index turned the mimic into something that collected people the way some men collect debts. That is where I found myself when I wrote the new ledger entry with my father's pen. The ink bled in a small way, but my hand held firm. Lights on 1830. Mirror sweep, 1900, 2200, 0200. Camera check, hourly. Radio channel, emergency only. I added a line my father would have liked for its bluntness. Do not open the door at night. Then I closed the ledger and set the pen down. Outside, the field smelled of cut hay and the late blue of approaching thunder. The tower stood like a small, brave thing in the open. The hat sat in its evidence bag on the desk. The watch ticked. The logbook warmed with the pressure of the pages. We were doing what we could. We were, as my father had been, keeping watch and keeping count. When I went to bed that night, I did not sleep. The rule, the ritual, and the ledger were my companions, and yet there was a small, animal part of me that wanted to follow a voice into the dark. It felt like a pain in a tooth you had been ignoring for years. You knew you should let it be examined, but the thought of what the dentist might find made you lay awake long after night had thickened. At 03:12, the hour on the first night of our public dossier, a voice called from beneath the tower in a modulation so precise it sliced through my resistance like a scalpel. Not my name this time, but a phrase my father used to say when handing me a thermos on a winter morning. Eat this, Brent. The voice was my father's past and the present. I felt the ladder in my hands again. I felt the metals cold. Then I remembered the rule, and the ledger, and the hat in the bag, and the way that small, methodical rituals had kept me whole for years. I did not go down. I kept my hand on the ladder, breathing slow enough that I could hear the generator's heartbeat under the floor. The voice stopped, as voices do when you refuse the instinct they were meant to exploit. It folded back into the field like a thing retreating from a light.
For a long time, I simply held the metal, feeling the cold climb into my knuckles. And then I went back inside and checked every notch in the ledger, as if the act of writing would tighten the world around me. The morning after the dossier went public, the road filled with cars that had no business being there. A graduate student came with a thermal camera and a careful face. A local reporter asked 3 questions and wrote them down as if the right sequence of ink could make the night sensible. Volunteers arrived of odd hours, people who thought that watching a tower for someone else's ghosts would be an education in bravery. Among them was Ellis. Ellis was 23, clean-jawed and impatient with caution, the way young people are indifferent to the long arithmetic of habit. He had the sort of curiosity that wants to run ahead and test fences. He arrived with a canvas pack and a headlamp, and when he introduced himself, he laughed a little too loudly at the right places, the way people do to make themselves likable. Maria liked him immediately because he wasn't precious about work. He could change a bulb or lug a sandbag without asking which part of the job was poetic.
Fred liked him because he had the look of someone who had not yet learned how to close his heart against other people's troubles. We trained him the way we trained everyone who wanted to be there. We ran him through the checklist until it sounded like a litany. Lights on 1830, mirror sweeps 1922:02, cameras check hourly, radio channel emergency only, do not open the door at night. We taught him the ladder rule, no descent alone after sunset, and the code phrase system for identifying real people in the dark. We taught him to lock his empathy in a little box and hand the key to the ledger. He obliged, in the way men who volunteer for watch do, with a promise and a small contempt for fear. He also hummed softly while he worked. A nervous, tuneless line he said was a family habit. Keeps your hands busy, he told me. Ellis's first month was the kind of time that slides under the skin. He learned the generator's quirks, the smell of an overloaded bank, and how to read the way the floodlights make rabbits jerk into the open. He admired my father's handwriting and asked questions that were too earnest for a man who had not yet learned the economy of silence. Sometimes he stayed up with me on the late watches, and we traded small stories about where we'd grown up. He liked to imagine life in towns a few hours away with bars and open mic nights and friends who would convince him to move on. He told me he wanted to be a teacher eventually. He told me this in the calm night, before the field got used to him. The mimic escalated the way it had shown earlier. Patience folded into iteration. In the weeks after Betty posted the dossier, the object returns multiplied, not by randomness, but by composure.
It began to arrange things in tableaus that suggested scenarios rather than simple trophies. A child's sneaker beside a watch, a coin on a fence post, a photograph face down on a stone. The cameras would capture a shape in transit, the field taken in a single frame, and then nothing. No footprints stretching beyond a certain point, as if a boundary had been enforced. We reviewed footage obsessively. The cameras were old and generous with grain. We used timestamp overlays and synchronized frames between devices to triangulate movement. Item numbers proliferated. 0092. Photograph 4x6, printed. Reverse side blank. Found 0517. Linked AT. 0106. Silver coin, no year. Found 0543. No owner on file. The ledger's margins filled with cross-references. Betty added columns for chain of custody and forensic notes. The field became a courtroom of objects. The night Ellis disappeared began like many others. Generator steady at 50% draw. Mirrors bolted in an agreed spread. Radios on emergency only. We had had a small victory that week. A grant was tentatively approved for a second generator bank and 2 additional floodlights, contingent on further documentation. There was a sense, brief and fragile, that bureaucrats would translate ledger weight into infrastructure. We all felt the small lift of that. At 21:58, Ellis signed out to take the first rotation. He promised to call in at the top of the hour and to hold until a second check arrived. I watched him climb the ladder with his pack slung low, the metal rung knocking softly against his boot. He had his headlamp, but not in use. It was an old habit to rely on the tower lights rather than bring new light into the field. "If you get called," I said, "repeat the code phrase. Don't answer anything else." "I won't," he said, and his mouth made the shape of the promise. He stuck his hand out, and I shook it like a friend, and he ran his thumb over the ledger as if that made him part of the ritual. The first irregularity that night was the sound of a truck at 047 on a road 2 miles away, recorded on the microphone in a band that felt as though it had been taught to roll. It was by itself ordinary. Trucks pass at odd hours on country roads, but layered upon it was a whispered fragment that the equipment registered as human vowels stitched into static. We flagged it, evidence 0143, road noise, low-band human-like modulation, perceived syllable, down. We played it at half speed and found a tremor that suggested breath had been smoothed away. Ellis called in at 0100, alpha check, he said, voice steady. I logged it. The record shows he chewed, perhaps nervously, the way some men do when they are about to speak. At 0134, something new occurred. A voice quality modulation came in on no channel, an atmospheric artifact on the microphones that was not routed through dispatch. It sounded like a man clearing his throat and then speaking in the private pet name Ellis had told me his grandmother used on him. It was short, intimate, Eli. Not his full name, not even close, but the pronunciation resembled the pet name he had described. I remember it because I watched him stiffen and then lean with a kind of anxious curiosity toward the rail. On camera, he looked like someone listening to a lullaby. "Did you hear that?" he asked me, eyes bright. "Stay up there," I said. "Repeat the code. Do not go down." The cameras recorded his silhouette at 140 as he slid down the ladder. He did it quickly, one hand on the rail, the other holding the pack. The image lasted 4 frames.
Then the lens caught the field and an odd blur that could have been wind or a passing animal. The next frame recorded the ladder empty, the pack abandoned at the tower base, straps splayed like an unset hand. Then there was nothing. The camera facing the tree line recorded a disturbance, a sudden stillness in the leaves, as if someone had pushed through the brush and then evaporated. We found his pack within the hour. It lay open near the base of the tower where the grass had been pushed flat. Item 0171, canvas pack, contents, small thermos, empty, field notebook, pages blank in the middle, a knit glove, single, flashlight, dead batteries, 3 spare AA cells uninstalled. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. His boots were missing. The only human trace was a smear of mud on the strap like a thumbprint. A nuclear silence sat on the field. We called for all hands. The agency sent a search team. Volunteers combed the hedgerows with lights. We followed the faint boot impressions away from the tower, and then watched as they stopped where the soil returned to its ordinary grain. We widened the search until the county lines swallowed the last of our footprints. There was a pack of distinctive patches on his jacket, a place name, a logo, and we traced them through phone calls and old contacts. We interviewed everyone who had been on the rotation. We pulled the security footage and sped it up until the grain turned into a film of motion. A neighbor with 3 dogs said he had seen someone pass a mere half-mile from his porch at about 1:42, but his description pulsed between certainty and conjecture. There was no body. There was no clear exit. Ellis's absence rearranged our routines with a furor that was equal parts practical and moral. I remember thinking of the ledger as a coffin-populated instrument. We could mark time, stack entries, index disappearances, but we could not replace the vanished. Grief did its own bureaucracy, a public memorial, a search fund set up by friends, a steady stream of condolences that felt at once necessary and inadequate.
For us on the tower, it was immediate and private. Rage that someone had left their rule book, guilt that we had not insisted on the ladder rule, the slow, aching knowledge that a young man had walked into a geometry we had only half understood. The ledger, the watches, the watchfulness, they saved some nights and failed on that one. The agency convened a hearing 2 days after Ellis vanished. Michael's face, always pragmatic, had hard lines around the eyes. He read from notes, citing gaps in protocol and recommending immediate policy changes. The county's lawyers wanted a narrative that could be defended. They wanted to show that the agency had done everything possible and that the tragedy was unforeseeable. Betty refused to let the institution paper over our errors. She argued with a calm I had not seen in her before. Make it public, she said. Force the county to fund safety. Make the ledger a legal artifact with timestamps and authenticated spectrograms. The public dossier went up in a second edition that week, with Ellis's entry redacted in the names column, but linked through item numbers and descriptions. Betty included a bracketed note. Volunteer status, trained. Ladder rule observed, no. Incident, person descended alone, last observed 1:40. Pack recovered, no body found. Search ongoing. The note read like an accusation and a confession. People wrote op-eds. Conspiracy boards sniffed and filled their pages with speculation. A woman wrote a careful, heartfelt piece about her son, who had also gone missing near the edges of the county 30 years before. The ledger folded into people's narratives, and those narratives demanded answers. Funding arrived after Ellis's disappearance. It arrived in the legalistic timber of necessity, a line item for increased staffing, funds for an upgraded generator bank, and allocations for a secondary camera system with battery redundancy rated for sub-zero operation. The agency mandated rotations and required that ladder descents be 2-person operations after dusk. They instituted a training program and required a certified rotation log. We took the money and we bought floodlights with a wider beam and mirror arrays that could be angled more precisely. Maria oversaw the rigging with the same practical patience she had always shown, turning the tower into a machine that could keep the light for longer. The paradox of the response was this. With more people came more audibility, and with audibility, the mimic changed tactics. It moved from small tokens to narrative assemblage. It began to leave arrays of objects that read like scenes. A child's shoe by a cracked eggshell, a photograph propped open on a stone, a shoebox with a single note placed on top in an hour it had learned was likely to be discovered at dawn. The trophies were not anonymous. They had an aesthetic. They were arranged as if someone wanted us to read the scene as a story about absent people.
We cataloged each group. Item set 0182, shoe, eggshell, photograph. Found 0512, linked incidents ATKL. The formation suggested intention, not simply theft, but composition. At the same time, the audio attacks grew more cunning. Where before the mimic offered mimetic fragments, now it layered voices on top of one another in a cadence that felt like a choir of remembered grievances. The spectrograms became complex, harmonics overlaying human-form vowels, breath removed or concatenated, unexpected low bands that resembled animal undertones. We began to see the mimic's learning curve in waveform. It was patient, iterative, and relentless. The penultimate escalation came late that summer. We had an extended rotation with a university crew up for observation. Cameras were doubled, mirroring each other's angles. Mirrors were angled to capture the field in a near-complete sweep. The generator bank hummed like a caged machine. At 0201, we caught a file that sounded like ownership itself. The layered phrase, clear as a stencil, "You stay, you keep it." This time it was longer than the previous clips, as if someone had practiced a speech and then read it aloud down a corridor of voices. The timbre was not human, but it had the cadences of human insistence. It implied possession. We played the clip in the common room until the coffee turned cold and letters on the screen blurred. Betty made spectrograms and annotated peaks. Maria adjusted the mirrors. Fred muttered rules like litany. My father's line, "The night listens, do not teach it our names," felt less like advice and more like a strategy. The phrase the mimic used was dangerous because it understood stewardship. It did not simply want to imitate, it wanted to assert jurisdiction. The logic of its language was not bestial, it was bureaucratic. Possession is administration, and to speak possession is to impose an idea of property. That night we sat in silence as an act of defiance. The radio changed to a low hum that none of us provoked. We ate cold stew and we counted mirror sweeps like prayer beads. The moral calculus of staying the course did not change with the threat. The ledger remained our instrument, and so we continued to log every irregularity with a steady hand. There came finally an item that felt like a covenant. It was dawn in late October. The morning had teeth. The frost on the grass made a sound like glass underfoot. Maria went across the field at 052 to check the east camera. She came back without the careful step she favored, the one that measured the ground the way some people measure risk. She handed me a small evidence bag. Inside lay a pocket watch I had thought lost in a way that goes beyond objects. It was my father's watch. Item 0244, pocket watch. Case engraved R. McDonald. Movement functioning, crystal intact. Found 0501. GPS 46.2031N, 109.6072 West. Chain present. Fragment of scarf tied to chain. Scarf thread matching sample in item 0017, Stetson sweatband. The bag was cold from the dawn. My fingers felt clumsy with it, as if a fine instrument could not be trusted to hold something as heavy as memory. I had spent nights winding that watch in my hands, reading time like a rosary. It had been a tool and a talisman, and then a relic in the evidence drawer. To find it there, at the edge of the field, with mother's scarf threaded through its chain, was to find language for a grief I had been avoiding. There was no human presence nearby, no additional trophies arranged as flourish. The watch lay alone on the grass, as if placed gently. The camera nearest the point recorded a shimmer of something in the corner of the frame, an aberration I could not explain. The footage showed a quick bloom of light in a patch of trees, and then nothing. We could not tell if the watch had been left by a person or by the thing itself. I held the watch until my fingers cramped. The movement clicked with the tiny, impartial insistence of time itself. The engraving was my father's, R. McDonald. The chain bore the knot of the scarf and a fragment of age-stiffened thread. The evidence badge was sealed and given a number and signed across the tape. I wrote the entry with hands that trembled, but the handwriting stayed steady. There is a kind of ritual in recording things. The act of naming is a small salvational duty. We did not open the watch until we were alone. Inside, behind the face, tucked under the movement arbor, someone had placed a single scrap of paper, small and folded, edges frayed. It was not in my father's hand, and it did not carry a signature. It bore 3 short words, written in a hurried hand: "Keep the light." I carried that scrap as if it were a fossil. It might have been a message from anyone, an old hand, the mimic, a prankster with appulsive malice, but it read like an instruction. We logged it. Evidence 0244A. Internal note recovered. Keep the light. The notation appended itself to my ledger, as if the ledger were a mouthbone receiving a sound it could not pronounce. There are rituals people perform when the world asks everything and gives back less. We placed the watch in an evidence bag and put it in a sealed locker with chain of custody forms. We photographed the watch with macro lenses and made spectrograms of the audio file from the night. Betty updated the public dossier with the new item and with a cautious line about chain of custody. The agency spoke of the watch in the measured language of record-keeping. For me, personally, the watch was the closest thing I had to my father's hands returned. The watch's return did not make the threat less ambiguous. If anything, it made the calculus sharper,
An object can be returned as tribute, or as bait, or as a proof that the mimic can learn not just how to sound like a human, but how to curate objects that matter to a people.
The presence of Mother's scarf intertwined with the chain suggested a knowledge of family signature. The watch's position on the field suggested intentionality. We treated it with the discipline we had forced upon ourselves. We logged it, scanned it, and turned it over to Betty for safekeeping. In the weeks after the watch appeared, the nights shifted into a new kind of labor. The agency's rotation policy meant more eyes, and more eyes meant that the mimic had to improvise. It continued to leave trophies, but it had also begun to target institutional vulnerabilities: a router left unsecured, a camera with a dead battery, a volunteer on his first lonely night. We responded by tightening the redundancies. Battery banks were rotated, camera checklists expanded, and the ladder rule was enforced without exception. Maria instituted a new measure, an upper deck rail with a secondary locking clasp, so that a person could not merely slip the ladder without tripping a sensor. It was an act of building not against the thing as a mythical beast, but against the geometry of human error. There were nights when the mimic tried to use ritual against us. It would take the shape of ordinary kindnesses and dip them in syntax. Voices that had once read as comfort began to appear as tokens in the field, phrases looped into audio that could be misread by anyone listening at home. Once, at 02, the microphones recorded a tearful laugh, the precise timbre of a sister's voice who had not been heard since 1986, followed by a knock that the camera did not catch. The sound was damaging because it asked for action. It demanded a human response. The rule, "Do not open the door at night," was an act of denial against such temptation. It cost us loneliness and the weight of saying no to the world's softest verbs. The ledger grew in a new way after Ellis. It acquired a moral architecture, mandatory rotations, two-person ladder descents, scheduled mirror tests, and a protocol for volunteers that involved mental health screenings and a mandatory reading of the ledger and father's rules. Betty, with her calm urgency, established a public interface that allowed redacted viewing. A member of the public could see the indexed items and the spectrograms, but could not access identifying personal data. She phrased it as a way to avoid panic and to ensure privacy while keeping the facts public. The archive became, in a sense, a civic instrument. We also formalized a training regime in which we attempted to inoculate volunteers against the emotional levers the mimic used. We played random collages of voices and taught people to respond with a code phrase that had nothing to do with intimacy. We practiced silence like muscle memory, the discipline of waiting, the directed refusal of narrative. It was in some ways a kind of secular prayer. Time, as a machine, did what clocks do. It moved forward without moral judgment. Seasons changed. The generator, properly serviced, performed like a loyal beast. The new floodlights cut more cleanly into the pines. The arrays allowed us to claim more field with less human footprint. The county added a small stipend for overtime and a part-time archivist assistant for Betty. The public attention waned. And yet the ledger thickened. The mimic continued to leave traces. It changed in small ways, and never all at once. It learned that code phrases worked like a firewall. It began to craft phrases that sounded like two different people speaking in quick sequence. It began to add ornamental elements to its trophies: a watch beside a child's drawing, a ribbon wound around a stone, a hat left on a fence post with a hair tied to the inside. It was as if it were composing a memorial, an exhibit about absence. On a late November night, one of those exhibits returned a phrase that felt like a verdict. The audio picked up a soft recitation, layered, patient, recited in a voice that seemed to be practicing English as an adoption. It said plainly, "Keep the light, keep the log, keep count." My father's line repeated back to me in the mimic's mouth. There was no apology in that repetition. It wasn't an homage, it was a demonstration of comprehension. The thing had learned not only the words but the ritual. They were the rules of our survival. It was a fact as unsettling as anything. The night had learned to speak our liturgy. The mimic's last known escalation in the season was not cinematic. It was a small, precise operation. It returned a box during a week when the rotation included a new set of volunteers and a visiting group from a nearby institute. The box sat on the field under a low tree, balanced on a flat rock as if offered. Inside, we found a child's drawing, a smooth river stone, and a photograph of my father standing in front of the tower the year he retired. The photograph had been taken from an angle I recognized.
The peg in the kitchen with the line of hats, the mug in the window. Someone had cut the photo so that only his hands and the outline of his shoulders remained visible. Item 0310. Photograph cut to hands and torso. Background, tower east face. Found, 0517. There were hairs tucked under the photo's corner. Hairs matching a sample I had from a scrapbook. We logged it and sealed it. The box felt like an epitaph and a question. Did the thing want us to continue because it could only exercise a power where power meant duty? Or did it want to make us believe that stewardship itself was its desired object? We could not know. We only knew we would not stop. There is a peculiar dignity in ritual persistence. All things being equal, pain accumulates, and so does the practice of avoiding it.
I found myself reading my father's journal in the small hours, the line about having kept watch for 15 years like a rope tied around my hand. I copied his rules into the ledger in my own hand and underlined them until the ink thinned. I slept poorly and sometimes dreamed in checklists. Oil, 75%, fuel, 60%, mirrors sweep at 19. When the world tried to palm me away with noise and lure me into action, I returned to the ledger and the watch and the rules and felt steadier. The public file grew into a modest body of civic defense. Betty's archive became a place people checked when they felt a sensation of the uncanny, a place to see photographs, spectrograms, and item lists. It had the effect of externalizing memory. No longer was my father's ledger a private shrine. The ledger was now a shared, evidentiary thing that made argument possible. Funds were allocated, rotations became law, and the country road that led to the tower had a sign with phone numbers for emergency and the agency. The community built a small memorial plaque for Ellis near the church, as if public grieving could anchor the recovery of a young man's absence. I continued to sit in the tower because the act of watching is more than surveillance. It is an ethic. There are things in this world that gather their power from the willingness of others to remain. We had been taught to be watchful by those who had needed to be watched for them, and so I continued. The watch bent me, but did not break me. It shaped the cadence of my days. I kept the lights and the ledger. I wound the watch. I kept count. There is no heroic finality to the end I write now. There is instead a quiet consolidation of duty. We had a night, a long one, in which the mimic stitched together voices it had collected from months of listening. It spoke our names in rows, a litany of absence threaded into a cadence that used the grammar of family and possession to unsettle us. It said repeatedly, in layers, "You remain. You belong." The phrase was not a confession. It was an assertion. It wanted to make stewardship into a sacrament, in which the object of worship was the field itself, and those who tended it were the priests. I sat through that night and did not go down the ladder. I lay my hand on the ledger as if it were an altar. I wound the watch until the click became a private metronome. I thought, in the small and abiding way humans think, about the costs, about Ellis, about my father's handwriting, about the hat in the grass and the horse in the rafters. I wrote the day's entries: lights on 1830, mirror sweeps 19:22:02, camera check at 23:00:01, generator load 55%, anomalies recorded 02:01, layered ownership phrase. I added a note in which I copied my father's 3 rules: light, document, silence. There are things you keep because they are the last defenses against forgetting. We photographed the watch, and the photograph, and the box.
We returned the items to Betty's custody and added the chain of custody numbers to the public dossier. The archive opened a comment field for controlled access to researchers.
Each season is procedural as well as personal. I logged the measures we had taken that year, the procedural upgrades, the additions to policy. I wrote recommended actions for the county and for any other tower keepers who might read the ledger. Rotate staff, enforce ladder rules, keep logs, catalog trophies, maintain generator redundancy, use mirrors, publish findings. I appended a personal line that was not policy but was to me sacred. I will keep the light. I do not pretend to have answers about what we were up against. The ledger contains artifacts and files and witness statements and spectral analyses, but it does not hold a metaphysical key. It is specific in the small ways that matter: item numbers, timestamps, carefully collected hair samples, and photographs. It is stubborn in the way facts can be. The absence of an origin is its own fact. We can say what the thing does and how it does it, and in that knowledge there is power. We can say it learns by repetition. We can say it collects signatures. We can say that light makes it pause.
We can say with difficulty and care that empathy is a vector, but we cannot say why it does these things, and so we guard against them. 15 years. That number sits in my chest the way a physical object sits in a pocket. My father kept watch for 15 years and wrote into his journal the line that made me come back. 15 years. I have been keeping watch, and I have been keeping count. The ledger I keep is an addition to his. For 15 years I have kept the light, because the thing outside the tree line is not human in intention the way a neighbor or a traveling salesman is human. It has learned our language, but it does not share our obligations. It does not sit with grief. It composes it into objects. If there is a last lesson I have learned, it is this. Documentation is a kind of defense. When the ledger is public and immutable and part of a civic archive, the mimic cannot take the world and make it disappear without trace. Betty's dossier made that possible. I have sworn to keep adding to it, to make sure that our records are the sort that a committee cannot ignore. We are not heroes. We are technicians and archivists and stubborn people who will not let private secrets accumulate into private harms. We are, in a modest way, a small bulwark. At night, I still test the radio with the same careful codes, still sweep the mirrors until the chrome sings, still count generator percentages like prayers. I still feel the tug in my chest when a voice comes close to a name. In those moments, I turn to the ledger and to the rules. We do not triumph over the thing.
We survive it in parts by refusing the illusions it presses upon us. The watch goes on. The archive grows. We have more lights now and a better generator bank, and a rotation schedule that makes sure no one stands guard alone for too long. We have more volunteers who understand the rules, and fewer who think bravery is a private virtue. We have an evidence locker, a chain of custody, and a framed page of my father's handwriting that I keep in a drawer when I am feeling fragile. The 3 words underlined twice: light, document, silence. When I close the ledger at the end of a long night and put the pen in the inkwell, I think of the watch in evidence and of Ellis's empty pack, and I make the same vow every time. Keep the light, keep the log, keep count. There is no promise that this will end the thing. There is only the certainty that the act of keeping will make its gestures more visible, and therefore more accountable. For 15 years I have stayed on this farm in Montana because I learned that what comes out at night isn't human, not in the way a neighbor is human. It learns names and patterns. It collects trophies and arranges them into stories. It speaks our phrases back to us, like a mirror that remembers the wrong things. My job is not to cure it or to name it. My job is to keep the light and the ledger, to make sure that every returned item is recorded and that every loss is accounted for. Where there is an archive, there is pressure toward public remedy. Where there is light, there is less place for hiding. If you want to see what we have cataloged, Betty has made the dossier available in the county archive. The files are public for researchers and for anyone who believes in the power of naming facts. The watchful work continues, and the ledger fills. I will keep the light and keep count, because that is what was entrusted to me, and in the absence of clearer salvation, it is the thing that keeps us from teaching the night our names.